She was just picking up groceries for Sunday dinner, moving slowly through Walmart's aisles with her shopping cart, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the same floral dress she'd worn at church that morning. At 72, Margaret Thompson looked exactly like what she was, a sweet grandmother buying ingredients for her famous pot roast, the kind of woman who always had hard candy in her purse and never missed her grandchildren's school plays. But when 3 masked gunmen burst through the store's entrance at 3:47 p.m., demanding everyone get on the ground, they made a fatal mistake. They assumed the elderly woman by the produce section was helpless. What they didn't know was that Margaret "Ghost" Thompson had 89 confirmed kills as a Vietnam War sniper, and some instincts never fade with age. 3 shots, 2 seconds, 3 down, and suddenly, everyone at Walmart was about to learn that the sweetest grandmothers sometimes have the deadliest pasts. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden courage and forgotten warriors, tell me in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe the heroes come in every age and every package, hit that subscribe button. These stories honor the veterans who walk among us, protecting us even when we don't know we need protection. The Walmart Supercenter on Highway 49 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, was a kind of place where Margaret Thompson had been shopping for the past 15 years, ever since she'd moved to town to be closer to her daughter and 3 grandchildren. Every Sunday after church, Margaret would make the same trip, picking up ingredients for the weekly family dinner that had become a treasured tradition. At 72, Margaret moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints reminded her daily that she was no longer young, but her mind remained sharp and her eyes still carried the alert awareness that had once made her one of the most feared snipers in Vietnam. Not that anyone in Hattiesburg knew that particular detail about their neighbor's grandmother. Margaret's official story, the one she told at church socials and neighborhood barbecues, was that she'd been a nurse during Vietnam. It was technically true. She had received medical training as part of her military service. What she didn't mention was that her primary role had been eliminating high-value targets from distances that most people couldn't even see clearly. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Margaret was taking her time in the produce section, carefully selecting tomatoes for a pot roast and mentally reviewing the grocery list her granddaughter Emma had helped her write. At 17, Emma was Margaret's pride and joy, a straight-A student who was planning to study medicine at the University of Mississippi. Margaret had just placed a bag of potatoes in her cart when she noticed something that triggered instincts she hadn't used in over 40 years. 2 men near the store's entrance were moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that didn't match casual shopping. Their posture was too rigid, their attention too focused, and they were scanning the store's layout in a way that suggested reconnaissance rather than looking for bargains. Margaret's trained eye automatically cataloged details that civilian shoppers would never notice. Both men were wearing loose-fitting jackets despite the warm Mississippi afternoon, suggesting concealed weapons. Their movements indicated military or law enforcement training, but their positioning suggested hostile intent rather than protective surveillance. Most concerning, Margaret could see a third individual positioned near the customer service counter, apparently coordinating with the 2 men by the entrance through subtle hand signals. For the first time in 43 years, Margaret Thompson allowed Sergeant Margaret "Ghost" Thompson to take control of the situation. Margaret continued shopping with the same casual pace that had characterized the past hour, but now she was conducting reconnaissance of her own. She counted potential hostiles, identified exit routes, assessed the positions of innocent civilians, and mentally cataloged potential weapons and defensive positions within the store. Her assessment was grim. 3 armed individuals with apparent military training had positioned themselves to control the store's main entrance customer service area, and what appeared to be a coordinated operation against a target-rich environment full of families doing their Sunday shopping. Margaret was reaching for her cell phone to alert authorities when the situation escalated beyond reconnaissance. At exactly 3:47 p.m., the 3 men simultaneously revealed weapons and began shouting commands that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Everyone on the ground. Now, this is a robbery. Anyone who moves, anyone who tries to be a hero gets shot. The store erupted in chaos as shoppers dug for cover. Children began crying, and employees scrambled to comply with the armed men's demands. Margaret found herself in the produce section with a clear view of all three gunmen and approximately 30 innocent people who were now lying on the floor in terror. Margaret's military training took over completely. Time slowed, her breathing regulated, and her mind shifted into the tactical analysis mode that had kept her alive through 2 tours in Vietnam, while eliminating threats that most soldiers never even saw. The 3 gunmen were professionals, but they had made several tactical errors that Margaret recognized immediately. They had positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire that could endanger each other if someone engaged from an unexpected angle. They were focused on controlling the civilian population rather than securing their perimeter. Most importantly, they had dismissed the elderly woman by the vegetables as a non-threat. Margaret quietly moved behind a display of apples that provided concealment while giving her clear sight lines to all 3 targets. Her movements were fluid and silent, drawing on muscle memory that had been developed through thousands of hours of training and refined through dozens of real-world engagements. The lead gunman was demanding that store employees open the cash registers and safe, while his 2 associates maintained overwatch positions near the entrance and customer service areas. Their attention was focused on potential threats from store security or early police response, not on a 72-year-old grandmother who was carefully calculating ranges and wind effects out of pure habit. Margaret spotted a Walmart security guard who was reaching for his radio, probably trying to alert law enforcement about the robbery in progress. The gunman near the customer service counter saw the same movement and raised his weapon toward the security guard. That's when Margaret made a decision that combined 43 years of civilian grandmothering with 2 years of combat experience that had never really left her muscle memory. Margaret moved with speed that defied her age and precision that came from skills that had never dulled. In one fluid motion, she picked up 3 large grapefruit from the produce display and threw them with the kind of accuracy that had once made her legendary among special operations snipers. The first grapefruit struck the lead gunman in the head with enough force to stagger him and disrupt his aim. The second caught the gunman near customer service and chest, causing him to lower his weapon reflexively. The third hit the gunman by the entrance in the shoulder, spinning him around and creating exactly the kind of confusion that Margaret needed to advance to a better tactical position. But Margaret wasn't finished. As the 3 gunmen tried to recover from the unexpected assault by citrus fruit, Margaret was already moving to phase 2 of an impromptu tactical plan that combined everything she remembered about close-quarters combat with everything she'd learned about Walmart's layout during 15 years of weekly shopping trips. Margaret grabbed a shopping cart and used it as mobile cover while advancing toward the gunman with the kind of tactical movement that had once made her invisible to enemy forces in Vietnamese jungles. She was 72 years old, wearing a floral dress and sensible shoes, but she was moving like a predator who had identified prey. The lead gunman, still disoriented from the grapefruit impact, tried to bring his weapon to bear on Margaret's position, but Margaret had anticipated his reaction and was already inside his defensive perimeter, using the shopping cart to deflect his aim while simultaneously executing a disarming technique that she'd learned during hand-to-hand combat training in 1969. The gunman's weapon clattered across the floor as Margaret followed up with a strike to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for breath and completely neutralized as a threat. The second gunman near customer service had recovered from his grapefruit encounter and was trying to acquire Margaret as a target. But Margaret had already anticipated his position and was using a display of canned goods as cover while she flanked his location with movements that were tactically sound and devastatingly effective. Margaret emerged from behind the canned goods display with a bag of flour in each hand, throwing them with the same precision she'd once used to eliminate enemy soldiers from distances measured in hundreds of yards. The flour bags burst on impact, creating a cloud of white powder that obscured the gunman's vision while Margaret closed the distance for another disarming maneuver. The second gunman joined his partner on the floor, weapon confiscated and threat neutralized by a grandmother who was moving like a special operations veteran. The third gunman, positioned near the entrance, had been trying to process what he was witnessing while maintaining overwatch on the store's potential exit routes. What he saw was an elderly woman in a floral dress systematically dismantling his team, using improvised weapons and combat techniques that suggested military training. More concerning, Margaret was now advancing toward his position with the kind of purposeful movement that indicated she wasn't finished with her tactical response to their robbery attempt. The gunman raised his weapon and tried to acquire Margaret as a target, but she was already moving with a kind of unpredictable patterns that made precision shooting difficult even for trained marksmen. Margaret was using shopping displays, support pillars, and civilian evacuation routes to mask her approach while simultaneously ensuring that no innocent bystanders would be endangered by any gunfire. Margaret's final approach to the third gunman was a masterpiece of tactical movement that combined stealth, speed, and situational awareness. She used a display of lawn chairs to provide concealment, advanced during the moment when the gunman's attention was divided between her last known position and the growing sound of police sirens outside, and executed a textbook disarming technique that left the gunman unconscious on the floor beside his confiscated weapon. 3 gunmen, 3 neutralizations, 0 casualties among the innocent civilians who had been shopping for their Sunday dinners when the robbery began. Margaret stood in the middle of Walmart, surrounded by scattered produce, overturned shopping carts, and 3 unconscious armed robbers, still wearing her church dress and looking exactly like the sweet grandmother she had appeared to be an hour earlier. The store's customers and employees, who had been lying on the floor during the entire engagement, slowly began to stand up and process what they had just witnessed. Their expressions ranged from amazement to disbelief to profound gratitude toward the elderly woman who had single-handedly ended a terrifying situation. Margaret calmly walked to the customer service counter, picked up the phone, and made the call that would officially end the crisis. "This is Margaret Thompson at the Walmart on Highway 49. We had 3 armed robbers, but they've been subdued. You might want to send some officers to collect them and an ambulance to check their condition. No one else was hurt." The police dispatcher's response reflected confusion that Margaret's calm demeanor created. "Ma'am, are you saying that the robbery is over? How many suspects are in custody?" Margaret looked down at the 3 unconscious men, surrounded by scattered groceries and improvised weapons. "All of them, dear. They're taking a little nap right now, but they'll be ready for questioning once they wake up." The Hattiesburg Police Department's response to the Walmart robbery was unlike anything in the department's history. Officers arrived expecting to find an active hostage situation or ongoing armed robbery, but instead discovered 3 unconscious suspects surrounded by fruit, flour, and shopping carts, while dozens of witnesses tried to explain how a 72-year-old grandmother had single-handedly neutralized the threat. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was the first officer to interview Margaret after the incident, and his initial questions reflected the disbelief that characterized everyone's reaction to what had transpired. "Mrs. Thompson, the witnesses are telling me that you personally subdued all 3 armed suspects. Is that accurate?" Margaret, sitting calmly in the store manager's office with her purse in her lap and her gray hair still perfectly arranged, nodded politely. "Yes, officer. They were frightening the other customers, and someone needed to do something about it." Sergeant Rodriguez consulted his notes, which included statements from multiple witnesses describing combat techniques and tactical movements that seemed impossible for a civilian grandmother to execute. "Mrs. Thompson, several people mentioned that you move like someone with military training. Can you tell me about your background?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering how much information to reveal about a past she had kept hidden for over 4 decades. "I served during Vietnam, officer. Sometimes old training comes back when you need it." Sergeant Rodriguez leaned forward with growing interest. "What was your role during Vietnam, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret met his eyes directly. "I was a sniper, officer. 1st Cavalry Division, 1968 to 1970. The statement hit Sergeant Rodriguez like a physical blow. A Vietnam War sniper would explain everything the witnesses had described: the tactical movement, the precision with improvised weapons, the calm competence under extreme pressure. "Mrs. Thompson, how many? I mean, what was your service record like?" Margaret's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a weight that suggested memories she rarely discussed. 89. Confirmed kills, officer, plus some that couldn't be officially verified due to operational security requirements. Sergeant Rodriguez set down his pen and stared at Margaret for several seconds. 89 confirmed kills was a number that belonged in military history books, not in a Walmart incident report. "Mrs. Thompson, that's an extraordinary record. Why haven't you ever mentioned your military service to anyone in town? Margaret's response reflected the attitude of many Vietnam veterans who had returned to civilian life without recognition or gratitude for their service. Officer, people didn't want to hear about Vietnam when I came home, and I didn't see any reason to bring up old memories. I've been happy being just a grandmother for the past 43 years. The interview was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret's daughter Jennifer and her granddaughter Emma, who had been contacted by police and were rushing to the store to check on Margaret's condition. Jennifer Thompson Martinez burst into manager's office with the kind of panic that only a daughter can feel when her elderly mother has been involved in a violent incident. Mom, are you okay? The police called and said you were involved in some kind of robbery, but they wouldn't give me any details. Margaret stood up and hugged her daughter with the same gentle warmth that had characterized their relationship for 45 years. I'm fine, honey. Just some young men who made poor choices. Everything's been taken care of. Emma, Margaret's 17-year-old granddaughter, looked around the manager's office at the police officers' witness statements and official paperwork that suggested something much more serious than Margaret's casual dismissal indicated. Grandma, what really happened? Everyone outside is talking about how you fought off armed robbers. Margaret's response was typically modest. I just did what needed to be done, sweetheart. Sometimes people need help, and you help them if you can. Sergeant Rodriguez felt compelled to provide Jennifer and Emma with a more complete picture of what their mother and grandmother had accomplished. Mrs. Martinez, your mother single-handedly subdued 3 armed robbers who were threatening dozens of innocent people. She used combat techniques and tactical awareness that saved lives and prevented what could have been a tragic situation. Jennifer stared at her mother with amazement. Mom, I had no idea you knew how to do anything like that. Margaret's response was quiet and honest. There are a lot of things about my past that I've never talked about. Honey, some experiences are better left in the past. Emma, however, was fascinated by the revelation about her grandmother's military background. Grandma, you were in Vietnam? You were a soldier. Margaret nodded. I was a sniper, Emma. It was a long time ago, and it was a very different world. Emma's eyes widened with amazement and pride. Grandma, that's incredible. You were a war hero, and we never knew. Margaret's expression softened as she looked at her granddaughter. Emma, I wasn't a hero. I was just a young woman doing a job that needed to be done. Just like today. After the police completed their initial interviews and the 3 suspects were transported to hospital for medical evaluation before being booked into jail, Margaret insisted on finishing her grocery shopping. The store manager offered to have her items delivered, but Margaret politely declined. I came here to buy groceries for Sunday dinner, and that's what I'm going to do. Margaret completed her shopping with the same methodical care she'd shown before the robbery, selecting produce, checking her list, and moving through the aisles as if nothing unusual had happened. Other customers kept their distance, partly out of respect and partly out of amazement at what they had witnessed. When Margaret reached the checkout line, the cashier, a young woman named Ashley, who had been working during the robbery, refused to accept payment for Margaret's groceries. Mrs. Thompson, your money's no good here. What you did today, I've never seen anything like it. You saved all of us. Margaret smiled gently. Ashley, I appreciate the sentiment, but I pay for my groceries just like everyone else. I'm not looking for special treatment. Ashley insisted, with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Thompson, those men were going to hurt people. I could see it in their eyes. You risked your life to protect strangers. That makes you a hero in my book. Margaret accepted the young woman's gratitude with grace, but her response reflected the humility that had characterized her approach to both military service and civilian life. Ashley, I just did what anyone would do in that situation. When people are in danger, you help if you can. As Margaret loaded her groceries into her car and prepared to drive home, she reflected on how quickly her quiet Sunday afternoon had turned into a reminder of skills and experiences she had thought were safely buried in the past. For 43 years, Margaret Thompson had been content being a grandmother attending church, and maintaining the peaceful civilian life she had built after returning from Vietnam. But today had proven that some training never really fades, and some instincts remain ready to protect innocent people regardless of age or circumstances. Margaret drove home to the familiar streets of Hattiesburg, looking forward to preparing Sunday dinner for her family and returning to the normal routine that had provided comfort and purpose for the past decade and a half. But Margaret also knew that her carefully maintained privacy about her military service had been permanently compromised. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know that their neighbor's grandmother was a Vietnam War veteran with a combat record that most people could barely comprehend. The question was whether that knowledge would change how people treated her, or whether she could continue being just Margaret Thompson, the sweet grandmother who made the best pot roast in Mississippi. The news of Margaret Thompson's actions at Walmart spread through Hattiesburg with a speed that only small-town stories can achieve. By Sunday evening, Margaret's phone was ringing constantly with calls from neighbors, church members, and local news reporters who wanted to interview the grandmother who had stopped an armed robbery. Margaret politely declined all interview requests and asked her family to respect her privacy, but she couldn't control the conversations happening throughout the community about her military background and the combat skills she had displayed. The most significant reaction came from Margaret's own family, particularly her granddaughter Emma, who had returned home with dozens of questions about her grandmother's past and a burning curiosity about the military service that had never been discussed in detail. That evening, as Margaret prepared her famous pot roast for the weekly family dinner, Emma approached her in the kitchen with the kind of direct questioning that only teenagers can manage. "Grandma, I need to know more about Vietnam. About what you did there. About who you really are." Margaret paused in her cooking and looked at her granddaughter with a measured consideration that came from decades of keeping painful memories private. "Emma, what I did in Vietnam was a long time ago. It was a different world, and I was a very different person." Emma wasn't satisfied with evasive answers. "Grandma, the police officer said you had 89 confirmed kills. That means you killed 89 people. How do you live with that?" Margaret set down her cooking utensils and turned to face Emma directly. The conversation she had been avoiding for 17 years was finally unavoidable. "Emma, I served my country during a war that was complicated and controversial. I did what I was trained to do, and I did it well. But every person I killed was someone who was trying to kill American soldiers or innocent civilians." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "I don't live with guilt about my service, Emma. I live with the knowledge that I helped protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Just like today at Walmart." Emma processed this information with the kind of intellectual honesty that Margaret had always admired in her granddaughter. "Grandma, were you scared today when you saw those gunmen?" Margaret's response was completely honest. "No, Emma, I wasn't scared. I was focused on neutralizing threats to innocent people. Fear is a luxury you can't afford when lives depend on your actions." Emma looked at her grandmother with new understanding and profound respect. "Grandma, you're not just a war hero. You're still a hero. You proved that today." Margaret smiled with the warmth that had always characterized her relationship with her grandchildren. "Emma, I'm your grandmother who makes pot roast and goes to church on Sundays. Everything else is just old history." But Emma wasn't finished with her questions. "Grandma, do you still have your military things? Your medals and awards and stuff from Vietnam?" Margaret hesitated. She had kept her military memorabilia, but it was stored in boxes in her closet where it had remained untouched for decades. "I have some things put away, Emma, but I don't look at them very often." Emma's request was immediate and earnest. "Can I see them? Please? I want to understand who you were before you were my grandmother." Margaret realized that her granddaughter deserved to know the complete truth about her family's history, including the parts that had been hidden for over 4 decades. "After dinner, Emma, I'll show you what I kept from those days." 2 hours later, after the family dinner had concluded and Margaret's daughter and son-in-law had returned home, Margaret and Emma sat in Margaret's bedroom surrounded by boxes that contained the carefully preserved remnants of a military career that had been legendary in its time. Margaret opened the first box, revealing uniforms that still carried the creases from their last wearing, photographs of young soldiers in Vietnamese jungles, and official documents that chronicle the service record of exceptional distinction. Emma examined each item with fascination and growing amazement. "Grandma, look at all these medals. What did you get them for?" Margaret identified each decoration, explaining the circumstances that had led to their award while downplaying her own role in the events they commemorated. "This is a Silver Star for actions during a rescue operation in 1969. This is a Bronze Star for extended combat service. These are Purple Hearts for wounds I received during different engagements." But the item that captured Emma's attention most was a worn leather case that contained Margaret's sniper rifle scope and a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. "Grandma, what's in the notebook?" Margaret's expression became more serious as she opened the notebook and showed Emma pages of detailed entries recording dates, locations, ranges, and target descriptions. "This is my sniper log, Emma. Every shot I took, every mission I completed, every life I took in service to my country. I kept detailed records because accuracy and accountability were part of the job." Emma read several entries, trying to comprehend the clinical precision with which her grandmother had recorded taking human lives in combat situations. "Grandma, this is incredible and terrifying. You were so young when you did all this." Margaret nodded. "I was 19 when I arrived in Vietnam, Emma, just 2 years older than you are now. I came home when I was 21, and I've spent the last 51 years trying to be the person I want to be instead of the person the war made me." Emma looked up from the notebook with tears in her eyes. "Grandma, you've been a war hero my entire life, and I never knew. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Margaret's response reflected the complex emotions that many Vietnam veterans carried about their service and their homecoming. "Emma, when I came home from Vietnam, people didn't want to hear about the war. They wanted to forget it happened. So I learned to be quiet about my service and focus on building a civilian life." Margaret closed the notebook and returned it to the leather case. "I became a grandmother, and that was enough for me. I didn't need recognition or gratitude. I just wanted to watch my family grow up in the peaceful world that I had helped protect." Emma hugged her grandmother with a new depth of understanding and respect. "Grandma, I'm proud of you for what you did in Vietnam, for what you did today, and for being the best grandmother anyone could ask for." Margaret returned the hug with the warmth and love that had characterized their relationship since Emma was born. "Emma, I hope you understand that everything I did in Vietnam and today was about protecting people I cared about. That's what family does. We protect each other, no matter what it costs." As they returned Margaret's military memorabilia to storage, Emma made a request that would change how their family understood their history. "Grandma, I want to write about your story for my senior project at school, about your military service, about today at Walmart, about what it means to be a hero." Margaret considered the request carefully. "Emma, if you write about my story, people will know details about my past that I've kept private for decades." Emma nodded with understanding. "Grandma, I think people should know. Not because you need recognition, but because stories like yours inspire other people to be brave when they need to be." Margaret realized that her granddaughter was right. Her story wasn't just about military service or combat skills. It was about ordinary people who find the courage to protect others when circumstances demand extraordinary actions. "Emma, if you want to write about my story, you have my permission. But remember that the real message isn't about war or violence. It's about service, sacrifice, and the responsibility we all have to protect people who can't protect themselves." Emma smiled with the kind of determination that reminded Margaret of herself at the same age. "Grandma, I promise I'll tell your story the right way. People need to know that heroes come in all ages, and they're often the people you'd least expect." 6 months later, Emma's senior project about her grandmother's military service and the Walmart incident earned recognition at the state level and was featured in several national publications about unsung American heroes. But more importantly, Emma's project inspired other families to learn about their own hidden histories and to appreciate the veterans who had quietly transitioned from military service to civilian life without seeking recognition for their sacrifices. Margaret Thompson continued living in Hattiesburg, attending church, and making pot roast for Sunday dinners. But now she was also recognized as a living reminder that the greatest heroes are often the people who serve without expecting gratitude, protect without seeking recognition, and demonstrate courage when circumstances demand nothing less than their very best. Margaret had spent 43 years being a grandmother. Now, she was also a symbol of the Vietnam veterans who had served with distinction, returned to civilian life without fanfare, and continued protecting their communities long after their military service had ended. Some heroes were uniforms, others were floral dresses, and carried purses full of hard candy. But they all share the same commitment to protecting innocent people, regardless of the personal cost.